Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the wide world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy the show, then don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you very much. Regular listeners will know that we love an anniversary here on the Klassiki Podcast. And 2025 is the centenary year of one of Soviet cinema's true greats. Marlen Khutsiev was perhaps the most influential director in the 50s and 60s period known as the thaw, when Soviet culture flourished in the relative freedom of the post-Stalin years. If there was such a thing as the Soviet New Wave, then Khutsiev was its beating heart. In films like I Am 20 and July Rain, he borrowed from the neorealists in Italy and the iconoclasts in the French New Wave to depict a society on the brink of transformation. To celebrate Khutsiev in his 100th year and to figure out his place in this film history, I sat down with Boris Nelepo. Boris is a programmer and a critic from Moscow, now based in Lisbon, where he is the co-head of programming at the DocLisboa Film Festival. Boris knew Khutsiev towards the end of his life and has written movingly on the director's significance to Soviet and Russian cinema more broadly. Check out the links in the show description to read Boris's tribute to his friend Khutsiev and to watch Khutsiev's classic films I Am 20 and Spring on Zarechny Street on Klassiki now. Boris, thanks so much for joining us on the Klassiki Podcast.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this honor to talk about filmmaker whom I love very much.
I love him as well. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. Marlen Khutsiev. Let's just start with a broad introductory question, which I'm sure we'd both have our own thoughts on. Why is Khutsiev so important for Soviet film history, for Russian film history? Why is he such a singular, important figure? Why is it worth taking the time to look back on him now in his centenary year?
Well, in fact, it's not such an easy question.
No, but the first questions are always the hardest.
And the answer is not so simple, but I think what is the most important that Marlen made his first films in mid 50s, meaning that when he directed his first feature film, Spring on Zarechny Street, it was 56, meaning 3 years after the death of Stalin. When Stalin died, of course, the whole country and the whole Soviet Union and the whole cultural landscape changed enormously. The next leader of Soviet Union, his name was Nikita Khrushchev, and the period after the death of Stalin was called Khrushchev thaw. And Marlen Khutsiev was among those filmmakers, this new generation of post-Stalinist filmmaking. And basically, already in 50s with, Spring on Zarechny Street is really considered as like the first film of this like new wave, and new wave, not just of filmmaking, but of seeing the world, showing the world, showing the people. And actually the film was enormously famous. Like 30 million people watched it on the year of release, and basically it's still one of the most well-known and most have seen films in ex-Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think maybe people who have an interest in Soviet cinema might be aware of a film like The Cranes Are Flying by Mikhail Kalatozov, which came out a year later, which, won at Cannes and is often held up as, this epochal film of the thaw, of this post-Stalinist moment. But you're right that in the Soviet Union, there had already been this huge sensation with Khutsiev's first film, Spring on Zarechny Street. But maybe I'll just follow up with a little extra question. And he has this importance in that this particular historical moment, but why is he still such an important figure today? Because that's a lot, 1956 is It's 70 years ago now. So why is he still so important?
Despite the fact that he didn't direct too many films, he only
That's true.
made like
Yeah.
seven feature fiction films. But in a way, uh, somehow almost each his film became sort of a mirror, sort of a time capsule of the whole decade. And
Mm,
in Soviet Union, decade after decade, the country was changing like radically, ways, political ways, artistic ways. So of course, like 50s, the decade of 50s is a decade when people just try to, how to say, to resurrect, to come back a bit, back to their life after like Stalinist times and repressions, but also after the experience of Second World War. But then the 60s, it's of course 60s in all the world is this incredible decade of new waves,
yeah.
decade, yes, of youth, of the protests. But for Soviet Union, it was particularly the decade of the arrival of the first post-war generation.
Yeah.
And he made films. I'm 20, like with iconic title, and July Rain, which became like mirrors of 60s. So when we talk about how to say, even though 60s was also quite a long time ago, but like I think all our culture and film culture especially, like still obsessed and fascinated with 60s. If you talk about France, about a new wave in France, about Paris protests in 68, and that was also something the case of Soviet Union. But then, of course, after like this huge inspiration of 60s came some like disappointment, and it was like also political disappointment, which was also reflected in his films and like in 70s and 80s. And then his actually last, like really last fiction feature film, which is called Infinitus. It was a film from like that he finished in 91. So he finished the film in synchronicity with the end of Soviet Union and the whole Soviet project. And I believe that Infinitus, which is quite not really well-known film, quite
Mm.
obscure film, and even in his filmography as well. But in my opinion, Infinitus is really one of the most important, one of the greatest Soviet films ever made, which we could compare like with the best achievements of Andrei Tarkovsky or Alexander Sokurov.
I really like how you described it there. That his body of work is quite small, but each film is a time capsule that you could use to represent a whole decade, a whole a political kind of atmosphere, a whole mood, a generation. Even it's yeah, I really like that way of describing it. So before we get into maybe some of the history behind Khutsiev and talk about his films in a bit more depth, I did want to ask you. You knew Marlen Khutsiev towards the end of his life. You kind of got to know him a bit personally. So I did want to ask, how did you get to know him? Because at that point, he would have been in his 80s, in his 90s, and what was the character of the man that you came to know in the 21st century?
Right, it's really I was like very privileged. It's one of the most beautiful things happened in my life that I had the chance and had my luck to meet him and to spend some of the time together. I mean, that was very simple. At the time, I worked at Locarno Film Festival, and I suggested to Karl Shatrian, at that time artistic director of Locarno Film Festival, to award Marlen Khutsiev with honorary Golden Leopard of Locarno Film Festival, and therefore to dedicate like retrospective focus in the festival.
So
So and after
this would have been in 2015, about 10 years
it
ago,
was
right?
exactly, it was
Yeah.
2000, yes, it was 2015 when he just turned 90 years old. And I have to say that it was quite it was quite interesting that of course Locarno, because it's like big A-class festival and like all spotlight is on Locarno. And after that retrospective and after that prize, Marlen suddenly, like in the last years of his life, suddenly regained a lot of recognition and a lot of love and a lot of interest, because like after Locarno he had the retrospective in French Cinematheque, in Portuguese Cinematheque, and Harvard Film Archive, I think in MoMA, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, I personally curated his retrospectives in Argentina and Mexico. But what I want to say is that for me, in fact, this is a very interesting phenomena, because I remember that when we did his retrospective in 2015, many like cinephiles and film critics were asking who is this filmmaker? We never heard about him. We never knew him. And basically, only at that moment I realized that when generations change, like generations of film critics and curators, suddenly you have to, rebuild the knowledge again. So in fact, it was also, I wanted to ask you why you became interested into dedicating like this conversation, this podcast to figure of Marlen.
Well, that's a good question. Well, because it's his centenary year, and I've had that on my mind, I guess, just being aware of it. And I guess because when in a past life, I was a academic of Soviet film, and I taught it. And he's just always been those films of his from the 60s, I Am 20 and July Rain, have always been some of my absolute favorites from Soviet film history. And they were always, I found them really easy to teach. I always found people reacted to them. And I just love that combination in those films of kind of youthful energy and a sense of potential and innocence, and also the cynicism and the sense of kind of quiet despair that's growing in the background.
I just have maybe one more little point to add, that when you asked why it's like interesting and important to talk about his films today, I was actually also particularly struck by observation of my like good like friend like and colleague who's film critic for Cahiers du Cinéma, who told me that when he watched July Rain and I Am 20, that he was struck to discover very different kind of Soviet cinema, the cinema which is not so far away from Italian cinema of 60s. In my practice as film programmer and curator, I already saw it myself, that in fact that's true, that films by Marlen, especially I'm 20 and July Rain, are very good introductions to Soviet cinema and the history of Soviet cinema, and they allow you easily to actually to confront with these cliches of what Soviet cinema is. In reality, I believe that Marlen Khutsiev was one of the most important and talented and complex Soviet filmmakers, but at the same time, how to say, he's also part of his generation and part of his time. Like these films, they're particularly good, but they are not like exceptions. It's not that like in Soviet cinema of 50s, 60s, 70s, it was only Marlen Khutsiev and Andrei
Sure,
Tarkovsky. In
yeah,
fact,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not true. Like the
Yeah.
truth that the Soviet cinema of 60s and 70s is enormously rich, but this is really like unknown. Like this is really unsung.
Now, just on what you're saying there, just to add a little bit to my response when you asked me why I was interested in talking about Hutsiev, I think that his films are very sincere. They're very sincere about things like the war. They're very sincere about the idea of having of there being some kind of social bond or duty that binds people together in the Soviet Union, but they're not propagandistic. And it's that balance that I think is really compelling. But let's just take a step back. So first thing, if we're thinking about kind of biographical details, right? The first thing that we should mention is that Khutsiev was Georgian, one of a number of Georgian filmmakers who a lot of people just presume are Russian because they were kind of subsumed into the Russia-centric studio system in the Soviet Union. But yes, he was born in Georgia. He was a Georgian filmmaker. So apart from that fact, which is very important, what are some other things about his biography that people should be aware of? There's what happened to his father, for instance, quite an important kind of traumatic
Yeah,
incident in his
exactly.
life.
Yes, it's true. I mean, yes, he was born like in 1925, 100 years ago in Tbilisi, which is like now capital of Georgia, and he spent his early childhood in Moscow. And then in 1937, like one of the darkest years for the history of Soviet Union, the year of like mass repressions, Stalinist purges, his father was repressed and executed. In fact, his father was like sort of he was communist, revolutionary, and do you know, by the way, why Marlen was called Marlen?
I presume the Len is Lenin and Ma must be Marx. Marx Lenin.
Yeah, exactly. Marx Lenin, yes. So, no, but that's also actually, it's not just a historical anecdote. It's just also to explain that, yes, like his father was devoted like communist participant of the revolution, and he was functionary like in Soviet Union state, but 37 was huge purge and repression. And after that, after his father was executed from Moscow, he went back with his mother to Georgia. I think what is very important that he studied in VGIG, like Russian
Yeah, the most
Moscow-based
prestigious
film
film
school,
school in Moscow. Yeah.
because he graduated in 52, like 1 year before Stalin died, and his master was Igor Savchenko, who is like now quite forgotten, but actually he's one of the key Ukrainian filmmakers.
Yeah.
And actually some of his films of 30s are absolutely unmissable. Just,
Yeah.
but this
Also
for
quite
another for
important
another.
in the Savchenko, quite important figure in the development of Soviet musicals.
And then it's very important, I think, to mention and to say that his first two films, Spring on the Заречная Street and Two Feathers, which is his second film from 58, he made in Ukraine on Odessa Film Studio.
Yeah, he was working. Quite a common thing, right, for newly graduated filmmakers from the Moscow Film School to be sent for their first kind of couple of features to one of the more quote unquote provincial, smaller film studios. So he went to Odessa, which very historic, successful film studio in the Soviet Union.
So, but I think that's, yes, but it's quite important that technically, not only technically, like his first two films are considered and should be considered as like Ukrainian films today.
That's certainly true.
Because it's
Yeah.
also very interesting, because if you noticed, I always try before to talk about like Soviet cinema, Soviet history, like I try not to talk like about Russian history and Russian cinema, because it's really very complex with Marlen, for example, because you said that he's like Georgian filmmaker, and I would say that he's more Ukrainian filmmaker, because technically he made two out of his 7 films like in Ukrainian film studio. But in any case, his
Well,
connection to
Georgian by nationality,
yeah.
Ukrainian by vocation, Russian by language. It's these are the conversations you get into when you're talking about Soviet artists. So that's a little bit of his background. It's probably time now to get into the films. I think when we were talking about how to structure this conversation, I suggested that we could think about his films in 3 blocks, as it were. So there's the films from the 50s that you've already mentioned that he makes in Odessa. Then the 60s masterpieces, and then the later films, which are slightly more spread out. And it's these 50s films that you've already described, right, that really make his reputation and that really are still to this day considered really important in capturing the spirit of this period known as the Thaw, this post-Stalinist period in the kind of mid-60s onwards, from kind of 1956 onwards. And yeah, Spring on Zarechny Street and The Two Fyodors, his 2 films from the 50s, are super important to this period. So what is it about Spring on Zarechny Street that spoke so intensely and so poignantly to the atmosphere, the spirit of the time? I know it's quite a nebulous question, but how would you go about answering it?
It's interesting that Spring on Zarechny Street, like from this like big historical distance, when we watch it today, we can still see that this film more or less follows the tropes, the patterns of social realism, but like deconstructing it, because like the film talks about like big factory, and the protagonist like works there, and he goes like in the evening to the school to study, and he meets like the young teacher, and they have like the bit like love story. But I think but I mean, yeah, but more or less like the formula is not so different from like social realism. But what is important, that suddenly the films in this film, people are really like portrayed as people who could have their doubts, their fragilities. They may not be perfect. They may think about other things, as success of communism or succession of working plan at the factory. Like the film had a lot of like songs which became like super well known. And but yes, basically it was about spring. Like it's very emblematic that the film is called Spring on Zarechная Street.
Right,
But I
because with the
think,
idea of the thaw, right, is again,
yeah,
it's this idea of the melting of the ice, the passing of the winter of war and repression and so on. So yeah, like you say, the plot of Spring on Zarechная Street is quite formulaic, and like you say, it cleaves quite closely to these models of kind of plot and character that Soviet cinema had been beholden to under Stalinism. So, it's the plot is basically an odd couple romance between this raffish factory worker and a slightly more uptight school teacher in this town that's being kind of rebuilt or built up after the end of the Second World War. And like you say, he's a good worker at the factory, and he spends his evenings
not so
kind of
good,
educating
not such a good
himself.
worker.
But his heart's in the right place, which is important. He's not a malicious character. So these are kind of stock characters, stock situations, but then Khutsiev breathes this life and sincerity into them, and this is really, I think, the important point about this thaw period. It wasn't about kind of rebelling against the system. It was about reinvigorating the system. It was about rescuing communism, if you like, from the perversions and the injustices that had come before under Stalin. That was certainly kind of Khrushchev's way of presenting what he was doing.
Yes, for sure. In fact, that's a very important point, because also I think the general audience tend to perceive like such artists as like Marlen Khutsiev in this very like two-polar system, like pro-regime or dissident. And of course,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
no way Marlen Khutsiev, but in fact, all of the generation of artists in 60s, they of course they were not dissidents. They were seeing, actually, many of them really believed in the communism, and exactly as you said, they were seeing the Stalin's time as perversion of the original ideas of Lenin, which also, of course, brings like a big problematic thing. But also the films show some disappointment. I mean, it's very complex. It's not a dissident cinema, but we also need to understand that dissident cinema was not possible even in the most like democratic and liberal times.
Yeah. Revolutionary romanticism, right? That's a term
Exactly.
that gets used a lot. And it is romanticism in that real kind of classical sense. It is. A lot of critics have noted how in Khutsiev's films, human emotions are mirrored by like the weather and the changing of the seasons. So yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, that this film Spring on Zarechная Street was a huge hit. It's like it's a total classic still to this day in the Russophone world, and he follows it up with the Two Fyodors 2 years later, which is not as well known, but still was hugely popular at the time. It was written about a lot of the time by critics who were trying to kind of get their head around what was going on with the thaw and with these kind of changes in Soviet cinema. And then there's a gap until his next film eventually gets released. And this film has a much more troubled production history, but it's also, I would say, maybe his masterpiece. So the film, as it eventually comes out, is called I Am 20, but it wasn't originally called that, and it wasn't originally meant to look like it ended up looking. So, I mean, we could spend all day talking about this film and what happened to it, but what's that film about, and what do you think are the most important details about its troubled production history that people should be aware of before they watch it?
Maybe you could start talking about I'm 20, since you were teaching this film. Like, what is so interesting for you in this film?
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so I'm 20 is a film about young men, men in their early 20s. It's about this generation that doesn't really remember Stalinism, that was alive for the war but too young to have really processed it, as an adult would have had to, too young to really kind of remember what the hardships meant. And it's about their coming of age in this new Soviet society and trying to figure out what their social duties are and how much their kind of personal ideals and desires are in conflict with the older generation who were there for Stalinism, who were there for the war. And Khutsiev made this film originally under the title Illich's Gate, and it was singled out for criticism by Khrushchev himself in a famous meeting at the Kremlin where he gathered a bunch of artists, basically in order to harangue them. Khutsiev really gets it in the neck from Khrushchev. So Khutsiev is forced to go away and kind of recut it and reshoot it. And then eventually, 3 years later in 1965, it comes out as I Am 20. And Khutsiev did eventually kind of reconstruct a kind of director's cut. But there are several different versions of this film floating around out there. So, yeah, it's important because, again, it carries on these ideas from the 50s films about young people, about sincerity, about what it means to kind of have principles and ideals in Soviet society. But in the film's production history and also in its plot, you start to get these clouds growing. You start to get this sense of existential doubt and crisis. That's how I would describe it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with everything what you say. I would say why this film is unique, and it's really unique because this is really encyclopedia of Moscow life, not only cultural life of 60s,
Yeah.
and not just cultural life, because it's really like encyclopedia which captured the way society works, because it has, like, for example, the Labor Day demonstration, uh, beautifully shot. What is the most important that this film, which was released in 65, as you mentioned, meaning that it was exactly 20 years since the Second World War finished. And
Right, yeah.
as I already said once today, that this is really like the film which captures the reality of the first post-war generation. Marlen Khutsiev at that time was approaching his 40s. So, in fact, he invited to co-write this film Gennady Shpalikov, a very tragic figure, one of really the most iconic figures of 60s, who co-wrote the script. When even I talk about, like, this encyclopedia of Moscow life, we could mention that, like, there is iconic party, like, of young people where you can see Andrei Tarkovsky and Andrei
That's true. A
Konchalovsky.
little cameo from Tarkovsky, yeah.
Uh, Also, what is totally unforgettable in the whole cinema of Marlen Khutsiev, and almost maybe in the whole Soviet cinema, and which was really unique and innovative, is the last episode of the film, where the young protagonist meets the ghost of his father who died during Second World War, which is also
Yeah,
interesting because, as we know, that Marlene was raised without his father. And
yeah.
in fact, I can't easily even remember, like in Soviet cinema, scene of conversation like with a ghost is something which belongs to modernist tradition, which was not so presented in Soviet cinema.
Or to Shakespeare.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But like every time when I watch the scene, of course, like it's heartbreaking because like basically the son asks his father what to do and how to live, and his father answers that, well, that even though like he's 20 as a protagonist, he's already older than his father was when he died.
So that theme of a break or some kind of rupture between generations and that idea of the trouble of commemorating the war correctly, and also that very documentary style kind of ground level approach to capturing Moscow, that's continued 2 years later in his next film, maybe my favorite of his films, July Rain, another film about young people and their romantic and professional troubles and travails and hopes and dreams and so on. A really remarkable film, I think, a film that really captures that sense of having arrived just too late to a party, I think.
I would say that July and Rain, it could easily be seen as like a sort of sequel to I Am 20, but like in
Yeah, that's true.
unromantic and sentimental way, because this is a film about disillusion, but also actually July and Rain talks more about, of course, generation of Marlen Khutsiev and not the protagonists of I Am 20. And it shows exactly this clash between romantic visions of the 60s that we just discussed with you, how to go back to revolutionary values and ideals, and we see like careerism, cynicism, and
Yeah, I think it asks that same question, but it has a much more pessimistic sense of whether it would be possible to go back to those ideals, I think.
true, but there is one very important issue which we still didn't properly discuss, and for me, one of maybe the keys to his cinema, that all his films are very much influenced by the trauma and by the drama of Second World War, and July
Mm.
Rain is very direct in this, because like we see this sort of like Antonioni-esque film about middle age people making life choices, going through disillusions, also romantic ones, but then the film ends like with like last long shot, documentary shot again. It's very actually interesting how Marlen Khutsiev brings documentary shots to
Mm.
his fiction films with veterans of Second World War in front of Bolshoi theater, like meeting and like sort of celebrating the end of Second
Yeah,
World
it's
War.
it's like the preparations for the Victory Day
Exactly.
celebrations, right? And the protagonist kind of wanders through the crowd as they start to gather, and they're just kind of putting together the parade and the signs and the floats and so
And
on.
this
And like it slips into documentary almost without you realizing what's happening.
And I think that, as we already talked, that like two feathers is that like very much connected to this, as I'm 20 is very much connected to this. But of course, like now, like we talk now in 2025, when like Russian government and Putin like turned this idea of victory day almost into like some satanic cult of celebrating the war and like celebrating the
Yeah.
victory, like and in fact all these wounds that Marlen Khutsiev approached in his films, they're still very open, and actually all these films also bring us to like this very complex questions of today, because I also think that they also give us some perspective, that we don't just talk about these films as objects of like 50s and 60s. Marlen, by his age, he could have participated in the Second World War, but he was not drafted because of his poor health. He really wanted. He actually volunteered, but he was rejected. What I want to say is that he was experiencing some guilt and shame that many
Right.
people of his
Yeah.
generation were traumatized and that they died, and that he sort of was privileged enough not to be part of the war. I really believe that like this fact that his two first films were made in Ukraine, and that he was very much inspired by his like teacher in university, Igor Savchenko, who was key Ukrainian filmmaker, and that he is coming from Georgia. Actually, all of this brings us like big complexity of his mindset and worldview, and allows us also to be very careful when we talk about like Second World War and how it's being portrayed in his films, because in no way his films has any kind of propaganda parts, but same time they could be easily seen sort of aligned with what is
Yeah.
more or less became a norm in contemporary Russia, when they're not. And I think that that's actually, just to finish this line, I think that what is very particular in his films, that they really bring astonishing complexity of the world and of the people in his films.
I agree completely. And you're certainly right that, like you say, this satanic national religious cult around the celebration of victory in World War II, which the Putin regime uses to its advantage, is completely, that celebration of victory is completely different from a sincere exploration of the loss and the trauma involved in the war. But you're right that the ways that those two those two things relate to one another are quite complicated. So anyway, yeah, those are the 50s and 60s films, which are the ones that people, if they are aware of Khutsiev, will almost certainly be aware of. They're the ones which are by far his most popular in Russia, in the post-Soviet space. And he did manage to finish 3 more, feature fiction films, spread over a long period, over 22 years. And maybe you can tell us a little bit why they became so sparse. But we should just run through those now, because these are the films that people really probably won't be aware of unless they're already confirmed Marlen Khutsiev fans. But I'm sure you've got lots to say about why they are still nonetheless very interesting. So in 1970, this film, it was in May, or in the month of May. In 1984, a film called Epilogue. And then in 1991, 92, I can't remember the exact date. Like you said, right at the end of the Soviet Union, this film, Infinity or Infinitas. So yeah, I mean, what would you say? I'm sure we can't lump them all together, but just thinking about them as this kind of latter stage of his career, how can we characterize what he's doing in these last 3 films?
Yeah, but basically what was happening that after the problems with I'm 20, and even more actually with July Rain, because July Rain was not censored, was not really forbidden, but the campaign of criticism against Marlen Khutsiev was huge. So he more or less lost the ability, easy access to making films, and it was month of May was made for television, which means in Soviet cinema totally different kind of production. When in fact, when you see this film, you would never believe that it was made for television. But so it was different production, because film production was not available for him, and that's why actually, because it was made for television, it became less available, just because of archives, lack of copies, and for many years it was unseen. It was month of May, meaning May 1945, and actually it shows Soviet soldiers of Russian Red Army, of Soviet Red Army, having some break from the fights and spending the time like in German village. And then by the end of the film, they suddenly find out a concentration camp which stands empty, and which is, of course, very emotional and very scary episode. And it was actually one, like, it was 1970. It was not something that was portrayed often, especially in this subtle way, as Khutsiev did in cinema. Then the problem that he had much more projects than he could make, because he was constantly working on different projects. But yes, since 70 to 84 till epilogue, it was like 14 years hiatus. I mean, he made some documentaries. I'm not sure we have some time.
Yeah.
He participated in different projects, but yes, epilogue is a very beautiful film, which is exactly like we already talked a lot today. It's really postword to the mindset of 60s, and to like final like disappointment and disillusion. It's chamber piece film. Almost all film shot is in one apartment, and it like shows two men from different generation like trying to understand each other. It's a very beautiful film, which is made in the tradition actually of 70s 80s Soviet chamber piece films, but like being different. It looks much more humble than his other films, when in fact it's not, because it's very nuanced. But I think that for me the most important is to talk about infinity and infinitus, because that was in the end the super beloved project of Marlen Khutsiev. He worked a lot on this film, and I think that it really stands out in the history of Soviet cinema, because for me Infinitus is one of the very rare examples of like really modernist cinema in Soviet Union, and it could be placed for me like near Mirror by Tarkovsky, or near some of the films of Alexander Sakurov. So it belongs to this way of filmmaking and thinking about images and cinema, because like basically Infinitus takes place like in the consciousness of the protagonist, who travels in like sort of Proustian way, like in his previous years, but also in the previous years of
Yeah,
the
he
country.
becomes he kind of enters into his own memory as the protagonist of his own memories.
Exactly, and because all his Khutsiev films were dedicated mainly to the 20th century, and Infinitus actually he comes to the end of 19th century and how 20th century starts. So I think that like this is very very beautiful and complex film that should be discovered and rediscovered.
So then, this, like you say, he was doing other smaller projects, documentaries and so on, but really Infinitus stands as the kind of capstone on his career. And then, like you say, he's alive for another 25, 30 years after that. And you knew him in the last of those years before he died in 2019. Just before we go, just briefly, what was the character of the man that you knew? Obviously, it had been a long time since his kind of great artistic triumphs, and he was a very old man. But what was the character of this of the man when you met him and when you kind of toured his work around at the end of his life?
I think I don't want to fall into the national cliches, but like this kind of Georgian, like super generosity and hospitality. I mean, basically, Marlen Khutsiev was a hedonist. He really loved life, and he loved life until the last days. So for him, it was like the biggest pleasure to drink wine together. Like we were renting the boat in Locarno, and he was joking that he's old sea wolf. He was much more, especially in last years of his life, he was much more interested not in films but in cherishing the beauties and pleasures of life, which also actually could reflect some of his films.
Well, that's a really beautiful note to end on. I think we should wrap it up there. Boris Nelepo, thanks so much for sharing your memories of Khutsiev and running with me through this filmography. I really hope people take the opportunity to watch his films on Klassiki and to explore him more. A wonderful filmmaker, and it's great to have the chance to celebrate his centenary with you. Boris Nelepo, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.